Welcome back. We did go to a break quickly, and we're back with the story of U.S. President Donald Trump announcing that the U.S. Embassy would be moving to Jerusalem after recognition by the U.S. in terms of Jerusalem being the capital of Israel. For more on this, we are now joined live by our New York correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. So, Sherwin, thank you so much for joining us. Now, what's been the reaction on U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement in the UN corridors, and what are the Americans saying on the ground?
Well, here at the United Nations, there was a quick response from the UN Secretary General, Lulu. He emerged from the 38th floor here in UN headquarters just soon after Donald Trump concluded his remarks in Washington to really reiterate what has been a long-standing UN position, that Jerusalem is a final status issue that must be resolved through direct negotiations between the two sides on the basis of relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, taking into account the legitimate concerns of both the Palestinian and Israeli sides. Antonio Guterres went on to say that he understands the deep attachment that Jerusalem holds in the hearts of so many people. It has been so for centuries and will always be so. So a very different position from the United Nations Secretary General. We tried to ask him questions. They didn't want to take any. And I imagine they don't want a sort of a tit-for-tat to develop between himself and the United States president. But as you mentioned, Donald Trump coming out earlier and confirming what we had been speculating for for a number of days, that he will now begin the process of moving the Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Now, Sherwin, there's been a lot of reaction from, for instance, there's a call on Egyptians in Cairo who have rejected U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement earlier. Now, there's a call on Arabs who've been urged to unite against this announcement. What does this really mean, especially coming from Egypt?
Well, I think whether you're talking about Egypt, whether you're talking about, supporters of the Palestinian cause in Africa, which includes countries like South Africa, whether you're talking about the European Union, there's been a real consensus on the international stage that this is one of the core final status issues that needs to be resolved in direct negotiations. And they see this move by the United States president as undermining that to a certain degree. I saw a tweet just a moment ago from a senior South African diplomat that questioned whether the United States can in fact continue to be an honest broker in direct peace negotiations. You'll know that the United States has historically taken the lead in terms of negotiations between these two sides. So questions already being raised as to whether the United States can be trusted when it is viewed in certain quarters as having taken a side, particularly on such a contentious issue as the future status of Jerusalem. You'll understand that this was a part of Jerusalem that was annexed in the 1967 war and has since then always been a dispute. In fact, Israel tried to pass legislation domestically in 1980 that called Jerusalem a united capital of Israel. And this was the response from the international community was the passage of several United Nations Security Council resolutions condemning this move by Israel and qualifying that Jerusalem remained a final status issue that needed to be resolved. So the United States here again, we are seeing, much like the Paris Climate Change Agreement, is out of step with the international and broader international consensus. And I think that's what you're going to see play out in the days ahead.
Now, Sherwin, why do you think that U.S. President Donald Trump has come to this decision? And what's been the reaction from both houses, Congress, and, what are they saying with regards to this decision? Were they a part of it, or did he make the decision on his own?
My understanding is that this is the fulfillment of a campaign promise that Donald Trump made to his supporters. He's playing very much to the Jewish lobby in the United States to a certain extent, but very much in the main to his evangelical support in this country. This is fodder for them. This is will play well with his current support base. So this is a political decision. What the White House, though, more broadly is saying, including President Trump just a moment ago, is that they are essentially enacting existing United States domestic legislation. The U.S. Jerusalem Act was passed by Congress, by large majorities in both Congress and the United States Senate in 1995. It has not been enacted by any sitting president, including Bill Clinton, George Bush, and then subsequently Barack Obama, because their argument is that Congress was overreaching into what should have been executive action, and they believe that this decision didn't work in terms of the U.S. national security interests. We're seeing a different approach from President Trump. In fact, in his remarks, he said that he was going to deliver on this campaign promise, and has enacted and has basically instructed the State Department to begin investigating the appointment of engineers, the appointment of architects, as the process to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem begins. So essentially, the argument from the White House that we're hearing is that this is domestic law that they're implementing. The only problem with that is the United States remains a member of the United Nations, and therefore it is also subject to international law. So there's this grey area, Lulu, between what the Security Council would like the United States to do and what Congress and the Senate in Washington would like to see the president do.
Now, Sherwin, in terms of this grey area, as you mentioned, President Trump has gone as basically as far as criticizing his predecessors. You've mentioned Bill Clinton, you've mentioned Barack Obama, as well as George Bush. What does this mean going forward? As you say, there's probably going to be trust issues going forward for the U.S. and their decision making, and with regards to being a part of the UN policy and UN law. How are they going to work it out? Are we likely going to see any changes? This is par for the
course, I think, in terms of President Trump's stated principle of America First. I think you saw the kind of reaction from around the globe when he announced in June this year that they were withdrawing from the Paris Climate Change Agreement due to domestic concerns, essentially. So the United States has taken a posture under this presidency that they do not want to necessarily be at the forefront of all international decisions. So you're seeing this retreat from the United States on the international stage, and this is why many people are looking to the leadership of China and certainly the European Union when it comes to issues like this. This is the United States president isolating his country in terms of what really is the global consensus. And what does the global consensus say? We must use everything at our disposal, member states, regional blocs, to get the parties back to the negotiating table. But what the Palestinians have already said, and of course the Palestinians are one party to this conflict, that this could very possibly kill any hopes of a peace process resuming and any hopes of the two-state solution. So all eyes really need to be on what the Palestinians are going to do next, because essentially the ball's in their court.
Now, Sherwin, with just bearing that in mind and with everything that has happened between Israel and Palestine, are we likely to see more violence erupting?
Well, I think let history be our guide. I think when decisions like this come down, you are likely to see, at the very least, peaceful protests on the streets of the Middle East. I'm sure you will see protests on the streets of many capitals around the world as this goes against what, as I've said before, is the international consensus. I don't want to say that there's going to be violence, but I think a close eye will be on Middle Eastern countries, particularly after Friday prayers coming up later this week.
Sherwin, just going back to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' reaction and not really wanting to say much about this, do you think they underestimated US President Donald Trump's decision, and with the speculation that has been taking place before the final decision was made by Donald Trump? Do you think that they didn't think he was going to go ahead and make that decision?
I think the UN is cautious in tackling the United States president in the public arena. I think when they're confronted by, we, for example, wanted to ask a question as to whether the United States can continue to be an honest broker in these peace negotiations. Can they continue to be the facilitator, given the decision or what is being perceived as having taken sides, particularly on one of the contentious issues in the final stage negotiations, which is Jerusalem. Of course, they don't take any questions, so we can just speculate as to why that would be. And my speculation would be that the Secretary General of the United Nations does not want to appear on Donald Trump's Twitter account.
Americans on the ground, what do you think their reaction has been? Has anything come out from them with regards to the decision that the president has made and the impact that it will have? Are they happy with the fact that he is sticking to what he promised during his campaign, that America first?
Well, I think you begin with decisions like this, as we saw with Paris and other decisions, that these things tend to go down party lines. The Republicans will support their president on this issue. They say that it's a campaign promise. We saw a number of statements coming from the vice president pledging his support in terms of this decision. But we've also seen a number of senators, Democratic senators, write to the president before this decision was taken, saying that this was going to be a bad move and that it would undermine the United States' national security interests. So you begin to see this chasm, if you will, this parting of the waters on issues like this. His base will support him, and then I think there will be some rumblings in Congress, and I think that plays itself out in terms of the broader electorate. His supporters will back the president. They believe that he's fulfilling his campaign promises. And, people that voted for Hillary Clinton, for example, will feel that he's undermining America's standing on the international stage.
Now, Sherwin, just looking at some of the Twitter response and reaction to U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement earlier, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says, a historic and courageous decision. Thanks, President Trump, for his recognition of Jerusalem as his nation's capital. This is something that he's been hoping for a very long time. And that reaction, what's your take on this?
Well, all expected, I imagine. He was very cautious in terms of preempting what President Donald Trump was going to say. But as you correctly mentioned, one of the first statements from a head of state or a head of government came from the Israeli Prime Minister himself just moments after Donald Trump completed his remarks. And you'll remember that the Israeli Prime Minister was one of the first heads of government to ever visit the White House after Donald Trump took office. And Trump has since visited Israel. And so there's certainly a very kumbaya relationship between the two, certainly in the public sphere. So a very strong relationship. I'm sure this move was very well coordinated between both capitals.
Sherwin, you mentioned earlier the fact that a lot of countries are now looking to Asia, for instance, to countries like China, big powers that are coming up. Are we likely to see a shift with the U.S. sort of, as you mentioned, taking a back foot and other big powers that are coming into play, taking over that role of the U.S.? Because clearly they're now backtracking and looking inward instead of looking outward and taking care of the world as globally expected.
Well, I think, Lulu, we need to be a little more circumspect about this. I don't think a change in terms of the U.S. Historic role as facilitator in the peace negotiations is simply going to disappear. I don't think the Israelis, for example, would necessarily go for that. But I do think you're going to see more action in terms of the UN Security Council raising questions about the United States not implementing several UN Security Council resolutions that started in 1980 that speak specifically to the recognition of Jerusalem as either or's capital. I mean, this is very clearly spelled out in terms of these resolutions. And as you will know, Security Council resolutions must be implemented by each and every member state of the United Nations. It's the only legal binding démarche, if you will, or legally binding text that comes out of the Security Council. You have statements, you have presidential statements, which is the second highest, and resolutions are very specific. Member states must implement them. So if on the one hand you have the United States wanting members to implement resolutions in terms of sanctions as it pertains to the DPRK, then you can't have it both ways in terms of resolutions that remain unimplemented as it pertains to Israel. So I think already we've heard from a country like Bolivia. Bolivia is a non-permanent member of the Security Council. They indicated to us earlier that they will immediately call for an urgent UN Security Council meeting to discuss this action by the United States. But it's unclear as to whether the UN Security Council as a collective would be able to condemn any action, because, as you know, there is a P5 member called the United States that has the veto. And all statements need to be done through consensus. So I think the first indication of what we will see from the international community will come out of whatever meetings are held in the Security Council as it pertains to this issue.
Sherwin, is the White House united in this decision that was made by U.S. President Donald Trump?
I think the short answer to that is yes. I think the White House has certainly, the White House is there to serve at the pleasure, or certainly the staff members at the pleasure of the president. I think if the question was about the State Department and diplomats around the world, I think we have seen historically since the incumbency of this president in January that a number of senior State Department officials have broken with the leadership of, or the policy certainly, of President Donald Trump. But, he is the president, and they have to implement what the president desires. And in this instance, the argument is that they're implementing domestic law. There is this Jerusalem Embassy Act that was passed in 1995. Their argument is that they're merely implementing what several presidents who have come before him have signed waivers on every 6 months. So he's saying he's acting. Other presidents say it undermines U.S. security. This is where we are at the moment.
Sherwin, some of the reaction on social media, for instance on Twitter, where some are even going as far as saying that this could be a declaration of war. Are we sort of jumping the gun and moving way ahead before everything is discussed and finalized? Because now people are very worried with regards to the decisions that are taken and, the implementation process. How long is this move going to take, and, what's going to come thereafter?
As I mentioned earlier, I think it's important for us to see what the Palestinians say. But in terms of this being a declaration of war, let's just take a step back. There is a conflict that is ongoing as we speak. There's no need for a declaration of war. There is a war between the two sides. The point is that we're struggling to get the two sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, back to direct negotiations so that they can come up with a peace deal that is satisfactory to both sides and ultimately what the international community desires, including the United States. We heard this from President Trump a short time ago, is that they desire to see a two-state solution if the two sides can agree on that. So in terms of a declaration of war, I'm not sure that that is the correct terminology that we should use, because there is a war ongoing and we are now trying to seek a peace deal. Whether this in fact undermines the prospects for a peace deal is really the question we need to have answered, and I don't believe it's in my ambit to do that. But let's see what the international community says. We will certainly be watching what comes out of the Security Council, and critically, Lulu, and you'll agree with this, let the Palestinians speak for themselves.
Now, Sherwin, just speaking of international relations and international countries that have been working with the U.S. with regards to trying to work out a peace deal between the two states, those countries and their relationship with the U.S., what does it mean going forward with regards to this decision? How does it impact on the relationship with the U.S.?
I mean, this is one aspect of the United States foreign policy. I mean, countries have different interests, countries have different needs. If you look at a country like the United Kingdom, for example, that is negotiating its exit from the European Union, its relationship with the United States has become very, very important, because you don't know what they're going to lose in terms of whatever deal they reach with the European Union. The United States is still the most powerful country, both militarily and economically, in the world. So in terms of the U.S. isolation, I don't think it goes to the extent where the United States is stuck on an island surrounded by water. The United States is very present. It is a very powerful member here at the United Nations, and it still has leverage around the world. So in terms of how this will affect individual countries' relationships, regional groups' relationships with the United States, that will play itself out. But I don't think anyone is ready to turn its back on reaching out and trying to convincing the United States to change tack, particularly if there's a majority view that this decision will undermine not only the international consensus, but the prospects of a two-state solution.
Sherwin, just to bring you in as well, on social media, on Twitter, there's a reaction from Mahmoud Abbas, and he says Jerusalem is the Palestinian capital. Its history and size dictate that its identity will not change by a U.S. decision. This is just some of the reaction on Twitter, and this breaking news from Mahmoud Abbas, who's just reacting to U.S. President Donald Trump's decision. Just from that reaction and some of the comments on Twitter and social media, there's a lot coming out where it seems like someone else says Jerusalem will always be the capital of Palestine. There's already a war of words on social media, and we're most likely going to see an escalation of that as the days continue. The meetings that are to take place, How soon are they going to take place, and how soon are we going to get reaction from those meetings?
I mean, I think just the reaction, Lulu, just speaks to what a contentious issue this is. Let's not underestimate the actions of the United States president here. It really goes to the credibility of the United States in terms of being an honest broker between both sides. And I think just the reaction you're seeing, I can read you Mahmoud Abbas's spokesperson just a short time ago. He talked about how this is going to complicate things. It is going to be an obstacle to the peace process. Maybe it would even end the peace process. So we haven't heard that from Mahmoud Abbas yet, but that is certainly what many people are speculating about, that this could signal the beginning of the end of the peace process. Hopefully, they said the American administration will backtrack from the decision if they are willing to move ahead. The Palestinian Prime Minister, Rami Hamdallah, the U.S. decision destroys the peace process, while others say it preempts the outcome of direct negotiations. So these are very, very, very contentious issues that we are going to have to figure out in the days ahead. And I think the first port of call that we need to look at is this Bolivian call for an urgent meeting. It could probably happen as soon as tomorrow, probably before the end of the week. They didn't want to speak earlier about when they would call for it. But I imagine the Bolivians, who are a very big supporter of the Palestinian state, I imagine they will move very swiftly on this one, Lulu.
Sherwin, we'll have to leave it there for now. This is a developing story that we will be watching as the days continue. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for that update. That was our correspondent, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joining us live from New York, giving us an update on reaction with regards to U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.